The air in the Redemption Territorial Bank was thick with the scent of old paper and quiet desperation. It was a smell Silas Ward knew well. He stood before the teller's cage, his hat held in hands that were cracked and calloused from a lifetime of fighting unforgiving soil. The banker, a man named Abernathy, with a starched collar that seemed to choke him, peered down his spectacles at the meager loan application. "I'm afraid, Mr. Ward," Abernathy said, his voice a dry rustle, "your collateral is insufficient." Silas's shoulders slumped a barely perceptible motion, but it felt to him like the collapse of a mountain. He had nothing left to offer. The ranch was gone, and the livestock sold, the last of his savings, bled away by 2 years of dust and sorrow. All he needed was enough to see him and his daughter Ruby through the coming winter. Just a small stake. A chance. "It's a good piece of land," Silas countered, his voice low and raspy. "The shack on it is sound." Abernathy gave a small, pitying cough. "The Thorn place. My dear man, no one has lived on that property for 3 years for a reason. It's blighted." Before Silas could argue further, the batwing doors of the bank slammed open, crashing against the walls with a sound like a thunderclap. The midday sun, which had been painting lazy rectangles of light on the wooden floor, was eclipsed by 5 broad silhouettes. The man in the lead was tall and moved with the fluid grace of a predator. He wore a black duster that billowed around him, and his face, half hidden by the brim of his hat, was set in a cruel, mocking smile. "Apologies for the interruption, folks." The man drawled, his voice a low purr that sent a shiver through the room. "This is a simple transaction. Your cooperation is encouraged." It was Magnus Colt. Every soul in Redemption knew the name, spoken in whispers in the saloons and prayer meetings. He and his gang were a plague sweeping through the territory, leaving ruin in their wake. Panic erupted. Women screamed and men dove for cover. Abernathy's face went the color of spoiled milk as 2 of Colt's men vaulted over the counter, their pistols glinting. Silas instinctively pushed himself back against the wall, his only thought to remain unseen to protect the last few dollars in his pocket. He was a ghost, a man who had spent years trying to be invisible. But as Magnus Colt surveyed his new kingdom, his cold gray eyes swept the room and locked onto Silas. The mocking smile widened, becoming something sharper, something personal. Magnus moved away from the tellers, ignoring the frantic stuffing of saddlebags with cash. He walked directly toward Silas, his spurs ringing out a slow, deliberate death knell on the floorboards. The townsfolk, frozen in terror, watched the scene unfold. "Well, I'll be Magnus," said his voice dripping with false surprise. He stopped a foot from Silas, towering over him. The air crackled with a tension that had nothing to do with the robbery. "Silas Ward. Looking a little worse for wear. Seems the world hasn't been kind since you ran from it." Silas's jaw tightened. He said nothing, his gaze fixed on the wall behind Magnus's head. He wouldn't give this man the satisfaction. "What's the matter, Wardcat? Got your tongue?" Magnus taunted, his eyes glinting with a dark, familiar fire. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Or is it the ghosts?" With a flick of his wrist, Magnus's hand shot out, not for Silas's wallet, but for the breast pocket of his worn shirt. His fingers closed around a small, hard object and yanked it free. A silver locket tarnished with age swung from a delicate chain. It was oval-shaped with a simple engraving of a wild rose on its surface. Silas's breath hitched. A guttural sound of protest escaped his lips. No, not that. It was all he had left of her, of Eleanor. The locket had been her mother's, and she had never taken it off. He had clutched it in his hand the day he'd buried her, a cold silver anchor in a sea of grief. Magnus dangled it before Silas's eyes, a cruel grin spreading across his face. He clicked it open with his thumb, revealing the tiny, faded portrait of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Eleanor. Still clinging to ghosts, Ward Magnus whispered, his voice laced with venom. Some things you can't run from. He snapped the locket shut and slipped it into his own pocket. It was an act of profound violation, a theft far deeper than money. He had stolen a memory, a piece of Silas's soul. Magnus straightened up, his theatrics complete. He turned to the room, raising his voice. Remember this, folks. Remember the man who brought nothing to the table but his own misery. He winked at the horrified onlookers. A lesson in humility. With a final contemptuous glance at the broken man against the wall, Magnus Colt and his gang swept out of the bank and their saddlebags heavy with cash, leaving behind a silence more profound than the earlier chaos. Silas remained pressed against the wall, his hand trembling where it hovered over his empty pocket. He felt the eyes of the entire town on him, their piteous, searing brand on his skin. He had come seeking alone to save his family, and had been stripped of the one thing he had left that was truly priceless, his dignity sacrificed on the altar of a past he could never outrun. The shack stood on the edge of town like a forgotten gravestone, its silhouette stark against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. For 3 years, it had been the subject of whispers and warnings, a place shunned by God and man alike. Now it was home. Silas guided the tired wagon, its wheels groaning a protest against the hard-packed earth. Behind him, Ruby, his 14-year-old daughter, clutched a small bundle of their remaining possessions, her gaze fixed on the structure. She had her mother's eyes, intelligent and observant, and right now they were clouded with an unease that mirrored his own. They were destitute. The failed harvests had been followed by a winter that had stolen their last 2 cows, and the creditors had been merciless. Their ranch, the place where Silas and Eleanor had built their life, where Ruby had been born, was now just a painful memory. Their last hope had come in the form of Clayton Reeves, a nervous, twitchy man who ran the land office. He'd offered them the old Thorn place for a price so low, it was practically a giveaway. My brother, Elias. He left in a hurry. Clayton had explained, his eyes darting toward the distant mountains, as if he expected something to emerge from them. The property's been tied up in probate. It's a good structure, solid. Just carries stories. Now standing before it, Silas understood. The town's fear wasn't just superstition. It was a living, breathing thing that seemed to cling to the shack's weathered boards. The windows stared out like vacant eyes. The porch sagged slightly, as if tired of holding up the weight of its own grim history. Yet as Silas inspected the foundation and the roofline, he saw the truth in Clayton's words. The structure was sound, built with a craftsman's care. "It's not so bad, is it?" he said to Ruby, forcing a confidence he didn't feel. "A little work and it'll be a good home." Ruby nodded, though her eyes were scanning the property, noting the details he had missed in his desperation. "The windows are clean, Papa? And the hinges on the door? They're not rusted." She was right. For a place abandoned for 3 years, it was eerily well maintained. Silas pushed the thought aside. They had no other choice. This shack, this blighted piece of land, was their sanctuary or their tomb. He pushed the heavy oak door open. It swung inward without a sound, the well-oiled hinges moving smoothly. Inside, the air was stale, but not foul. Dust motes danced in the shafts of fading light that pierced the gloom. Furniture draped in surprisingly clean white sheets stood like pale ghosts in the main room. A large stone fireplace dominated the far wall, its hearth swept clean. As Silas checked the lower rooms, his mind drifted back to the humiliation in the bank. The feel of Magnus Colt's mocking gaze was a physical weight on his shoulders. The empty space in his pocket where the locket used to be was a cold, aching void. Every night for the past 2 years, his dreams had been haunted by the same images: the groan of stressed timbers, the panicked shouts of men, the smell of damp earth and fear, and Eleanor's face. her eyes filled with an unspeakable sorrow. He would wake up in a cold sweat, the guilt a suffocating blanket. Magnus Colt knew about that guilt. He knew where to stick the knife and twist. While her father was lost in his thoughts, Ruby slipped up the narrow staircase to the attic. She was a pragmatist, a trait inherited from her mother. If they were to survive here, they needed to know every inch of their new domain. The attic was cramped and smelled of dry wood and secrets. A single round window looked out over the desolate landscape. She moved with a quiet purpose, testing the floorboards with the toe of her worn boot. In the far corner, tucked away beneath the eaves, one board gave a little more than the others. Her curiosity piqued. She knelt and worked her slender fingers into the crack, prying it loose. Beneath it was not dust and spiders, but a small, unassuming wooden box. It was heavy, far heavier than it should have been. With trembling hands, she lifted it out and set it in a patch of moonlight. The lid was unadorned and unlocked. She hesitated for only a moment before lifting it. Her breath caught in her throat. The box was filled to the brim with stacks of crisp, engraved papers. They were railroad certificates issued by the Central Pacific and Union Pacific Railway companies, their denominations staggering. Beneath them were land deeds for vast tracts of territory in Nevada and Utah, and bank certificates from institutions in San Francisco and Denver. And beneath it all, nestled at the very bottom, were several leather-bound journals. Ruby's mind, always quick with figures, began a frantic calculation. The sheer value represented in this small box was astronomical. It was more than a fortune. It was a king's ransom. This wasn't just money. It was power. It was a new life. But as her initial shock gave way to a dawning understanding, a cold dread began to seep into her heart. Why would anyone leave something so valuable behind? She picked up the topmost journal. The cover was worn, the leather supple. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was precise, elegant, but the words it formed spoke of a mind consumed by paranoia and fear. They are circling. The first entry read, "Like vultures smelling death, they think my fortune is theirs for the taking. But I have made provisions. I have insulated myself against their greed." Ruby's eyes scanned the pages, her heart pounding against her ribs. The journalist, who she realized must be Elias Thorne Clayton's brother, wrote of accumulating his wealth through shrewd and sometimes ruthless business dealings. The amounts he listed corresponded exactly to the certificates in the box. But as the entries progressed, the tone grew darker. He detailed growing threats from former associates, people who felt cheated, people who wanted what he had. Near the end of the final journal, he named them. 3 names that made the air in the attic feel suddenly colder. Magnus Colt, a brute who understands only violence. Mercy Whitmore, a serpent with a respectable face. And Judge Harlan Briggs, the most dangerous of all, for he wears the law like a cloak to hide his corruption. The final entry was dated 3 years ago to the very day. It was a frantic, almost illegible scrawl. They know where it is hidden. They cannot get to it themselves without drawing suspicion, but they will wait. They will watch this house until someone desperate or foolish enough comes along. They will let that person find it for them, and then they will close the trap. A floorboard creaked downstairs. Ruby froze, her blood turning to ice. A new sound reached her ears, the jingle of spurs and the low murmur of voices outside. She scrambled to the small window and peered down. 3 riders had materialized from the twilight, their horses standing motionless near the porch. Even in the gloom, she recognized the tall, menacing figure of the man in the lead, Magnus Colt. They weren't just stories in a journal. They were here, and they knew what she had just found. The shack was not a sanctuary. It was a baited trap, and she and her father had just walked right into it. Ruby's mind raced. She shoved the journals back into the box, slid it deep into the dark recess under the eaves, and replaced the loose floorboard just as the heavy authoritative knock rattled the front door. It wasn't the tentative knock of a neighbor. It was a demand. Downstairs, Silas opened the door to find not only Magnus Colt, but two other figures who seemed to personify the warnings in the journal. An older man with a portly build and a face full of self-importance radiated a false authority. This had to be Judge Harlan Briggs. Beside him stood a woman impeccably dressed. Her expression one of serene concern, a mask that did little to hide the cold, calculating look in her eyes. Mercy Whitmore. Mr. Ward, the judge, began his voice, a pompous boom that was too loud for the quiet evening. I am Judge Harlan Briggs. We are here on official territorial business. Magnus Colt leaned against a porch post, a smirk playing on his lips. He was enjoying this, letting the judge play the role of the law, while he stood as the clear and present threat. Business, Silas asked, his body instinctively blocking the doorway. I've had enough business for one day. I'm afraid this cannot wait. Judge Briggs continued, puffing out his chest. He produced a rolled document tied with a ribbon. Pursuant to Territorial Statute 48B concerning the estate of the late Elias Thorne, this property is subject to immediate inspection. We have reason to believe that certain assets belonging to Mr. Thorne's creditors, and indeed the territorial government, were secreted on these premises prior to his unfortunate disappearance. The lie was so smooth, so practiced, it was almost convincing. From her listening post at the top of the stairs, Ruby felt a surge of cold fury. They were using the law as a cudgel. I bought this property fair and square from Clayton Reeves. Silas set his voice hard. The deed is in my name. What's inside is mine. Mercy Whitmore stepped forward, her voice deceptively sweet. Of course it is, Mr. Ward. No one is disputing your ownership of the house. We are simply here to recover what was never Mr. Thorne's to give. A series of government bonds, you see. He was holding them in trust. Their recovery is a matter of public record. A king's ransom in railroad bonds, Magnus added casually, his gaze sweeping past Silas into the dark interior of the shack. Enough to build a new capital. You can understand our urgency. He was testing them, fishing for a reaction, trying to see if they knew. Silas's face remained a stony mask, but Ruby knew her father. She could see the tension in his shoulders and the slight tremor in his hand. He was a poor liar, an honest man caught in a den of thieves. Judge Briggs, sensing Silas's hesitation, pressed his advantage. Refusing to cooperate with a territorial investigation is a serious offense, Mr. Ward. It implies you have something to hide. It implies complicity. Silas stood his ground, a stubborn bulwark against the tide of their corruption. You're not setting foot in my house without a proper warrant from a federal marshal. The judge chuckled, a condescending wheezing sound. My dear man, in this territory, I am the law. This document, he waved the paper, is all the authority I require. He nodded to Magnus, who pushed himself off the post. The pretense was over. Silas braced himself, but before Magnus could take a step, Ruby's clear voice cut through the tension from the top of the stairs. Are you referring to the certificates detailed on page 47 of Mr. Thorne's personal journal? The three conspirators froze. Every head turned to look up at the slender girl standing in the shadows of the upper floor. Her face was calm, but her eyes burned with an intensity that belied her age. Judge Briggs's pompous expression faltered. What journal? The one where he lists every certificate by its serial number. Ruby continued descending the stairs, slowly, deliberately. The one where he also details the precise sums he paid you, Judge Briggs, to legally obscure his holdings. He was quite meticulous with his accounting. The judge's face turned a mottled shade of red. Mercy Whitmore's serene mask slipped, revealing a flash of pure venom. Magnus Colt, however, simply smiled. The game had just become more interesting. A clever girl, he said, his eyes appraising her. Like her mother. The mention of Eleanor was a deliberate goad. Silas took a half-step forward, his fists clenched. Leave her out of this. She's already in it, Magnus retorted. Just like you are. just like you've always been. Ruby reached the bottom of the stairs and stood beside her father. She hadn't brought the box or the journals down. Her knowledge was her shield. Mr. Thorne also wrote about a tragedy, she said, her gaze steady. Something at a place called Black Creek Mine. He said it was the source of his fortune and his guilt. At the mention of the mine, a tremor ran through Silas. The nightmare images flooded his mind, the darkness, the shouting, the terrible final silence. He saw a flicker of something in Magnus's eyes, a raw, unguarded pain that was quickly masked by his usual cruelty. "The past is the past," Judge Briggs blustered, recovering some of his composure. "This girl is spouting nonsense from a dead man's diary. We are here for the government's property." "Then you won't mind if I share these journals with Clayton Reeves," Ruby said calmly. "As Mr. Thorne's brother and the executor of his estate, I'm sure he'd be very interested in his brother's final thoughts, especially the parts about his trusted business partners." It was a brilliant move. She had turned their own legal maneuvering against them. The threat of involving Clayton, a man they had clearly manipulated, and revealing the documented proof of their conspiracy, hung in the air like an executioner's axe. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the lonely whisper of the wind outside. The three conspirators exchanged glances, a silent, venomous conversation passing between them. Their plan to use simple intimidation had failed. They had underestimated the occupants of the shack. Silas looked at his daughter, a fierce pride swelling in his chest. The passive, grief-stricken man who had walked into the bank that morning was beginning to fade, replaced by the protector he had once been. He put a hand on Ruby's shoulder. "You heard my daughter, Silas," said his voice resonating with a newfound strength. "You are not welcome here. Leave." Magnus's smile never wavered. "This is just the beginning, Ward. You have something that belongs to me, and I always collect my debts." He backed away from the door, his eyes promising violence. Mercy and the judge followed their retreat orderly, but filled with menace. As they mounted their horses and disappeared into the night, Silas knew this was only a temporary victory. They had shown their hand, and now the real fight would begin. He turned to Ruby, his heart aching with a mixture of pride and terror. "We need to talk to Clayton," he said, his mind already racing. "I need to know what happened at that mine." The past he had tried to bury for so long was clawing its way back to the surface, and he knew with a chilling certainty that it was about to consume them all. The next morning, Silas rode into Redemption, leaving Ruby to watch over the shack. The town felt different. The pitying glances from the day before had been replaced by looks of suspicion and fear. News of the confrontation at the Thorne place had clearly spread. He was no longer just a destitute farmer. He was a man sitting on a powder keg. He found Clayton Reeves in the land office, nervously sorting through a stack of deeds. The man looked up, startled, when Silas entered. "Ward," he stammered, his hands trembling slightly. I heard there was some trouble out at your place last night." "You could call it that," Silas said, his voice flat. He closed the door behind him. "Briggs Whitmore and Colt paid us a visit. They seemed to think your brother left something valuable behind." Clayton paled, sinking into his chair. I told them it was a mistake to involve innocent people. Involve them in what?" Clayton Silas pressed, leaning over the desk. "What is this all about? What happened to your brother? And what was the Black Creek mine?" Clayton looked away, his gaze fixed on the dusty window. "Elias? He was a brilliant man, and a ruthless one. He built an empire, but it was built on a cracked foundation." He took a deep breath, the words coming out in a pained rush. "The Black Creek mine was supposed to be his masterpiece, a silver vein so rich it would make them all kings. He had partners, good men mostly, and you." The last two words hit Silas like a physical blow. "I was just a foreman," he said, the old excuse tasting like ash in his mouth. "You were his right hand," Clayton corrected softly. "He trusted you, and you walked away. He finally met Silas's eyes, and there was a flicker of accusation in them. The mine was unstable. The engineers warned him, but Elias was over-leveraged. He pushed the men too hard, cut corners on the timber supports to save money. He was so close to the main vein, he could taste it. Clayton's voice broke. Then it happened. The collapse. A whole shift of men. Buried alive. 17 of them. It was a massacre. Silas closed his eyes at the nightmare playing out behind them in vivid, terrible detail. The low rumble, the snapping of beams, like rifle shots, the final earth-shattering roar. He had been outside checking a winch mechanism. He had tried to go back in, but the entrance was sealed by a mountain of rock and earth. Elias was ruined, not financially, but in his soul, Clayton continued. The company paid out a fortune to the family's blood money, he called it. That's the source of the certificates Ruby found, isn't it? He could never bring himself to spend it. He came here to this shack to hide from the world, from his guilt. He wrote in his journals for 3 years, trying to make sense of it, trying to atone. And the others, Silas asked, his voice hoarse. Briggs Whitmore. Vultures, Clayton spat. They were his business associates who helped him hide the money for a price. When Elias disappeared, they assumed he was dead, and that the fortune was theirs for the taking. They've been waiting, watching the shack, knowing the proof of their own crimes was hidden inside, along with the wealth. And Colt, the name was a stone in his gut. Clayton shook his head. Colt is different. His involvement is personal. His father was one of the miners who died in the collapse. His younger sister, well, she was your Eleanor. The world tilted on its axis. Silas gripped the edge of the desk to steady himself. Eleanor's brother. Magnus Colt was her brother. The cryptic taunts, the theft of the locket, the deep personal hatred, it all snapped into place with sickening clarity. Eleanor had never spoken much of her family. He knew her father had died in a mining accident, and that she was estranged from her brother, a wild boy she said had a darkness in him. She had been torn apart by the tragedy, a quiet grief that had shadowed their life together. Magnus blames Elias, Clayton said, and he blames you. He thinks you knew the mine was unsafe and did nothing. He believes you abandoned Eleanor in her grief when you left. Her death. It was a fever, Silas whispered the words, a desperate prayer. Was it, Clayton asked gently? Or was it a broken heart, Silas? She wasted away after the collapse. Magnus saw it as another death on your hands. Silas stumbled out of the land office, the truth a searing weight in his soul. He had not run from his guilt. He had run from his part in a tragedy that had destroyed 2 families, including his own. When he arrived back at the shack, he found 2 horses tied up outside. His heart seized with panic. He burst through the door to find Ruby standing in the middle of the room, facing Judge Briggs and a burly deputy. Silas Ward, the judge, declared a triumphant sneer on his face. By the authority of this court, I am placing you under arrest. Arrest for what Silas demanded, moving to stand in front of Ruby. Vagrancy, failure to demonstrate financial stability, and obstruction of a legal investigation, Briggs recited, clearly enjoying himself. This property is now impounded as evidence. You and the girl will vacate the premises immediately. It was their next move. If they couldn't intimidate him, they would use the law to remove him, leaving the shack and its fortune ripe for the picking. The deputy stepped forward, holding a pair of iron manacles. Silas looked at Ruby, at her defiant, frightened face, and knew he couldn't let them be separated. But before the deputy could reach him, Ruby spoke, her voice ringing with cold authority. Take him, and every newspaper from here to San Francisco will have a copy of the ledger detailing every bribe Elias Thorne ever paid you, Judge. I made copies last night. One is already on its way to the territorial governor with a letter. Briggs froze his face, a mask of fury and disbelief. Ruby pressed on. Release my father, drop these fraudulent charges, and leave us in peace. and the other copies remain hidden. But if you or your associates ever threaten us again, your entire corrupt enterprise will be exposed. She was bluffing, Silas knew. There were no copies, no letter to the governor. But her conviction was so absolute, her gaze so unwavering, that the lie became truth. She held the journal in her hand, open to a page filled with Thorne's precise script, a ledger of names, dates, and amounts that would end the judge's career and send him to prison. The deputy looked uncertainly at Briggs. The judge's face was twitching, his mind calculating the odds. A long, silent battle of wills was fought in the dusty shack. Finally, with a snarl of frustration, Briggs snatched the warrant from the deputy's hand. "This is not over," he hissed at Ruby. "You've just signed your own death warrant, girl." He stormed out of the shack, the deputy trailing in his wake. Silas pulled Ruby into a fierce embrace, his body trembling with adrenaline and pride. They had won another round, but the stakes had just been raised to a terrifying new level. They were no longer just a nuisance. They were a threat to be eliminated. The legal pretenses were gone. The next time Magnus Colt came, it would not be with a warrant. It would be with guns. And as if on cue, Silas looked out the window and saw a dark line spreading across the distant western horizon. The sky was turning a sickly shade of yellow-brown. A sandstorm was coming, a monster of wind and dust poised to swallow the world and isolate them completely with the predators that were closing in. The wind began as a mournful sigh, a whisper that rattled the window panes and stirred the dust in the corners of the shack. But as the hours passed, it grew into a relentless, shrieking howl. The sky, once a brilliant blue, had become a roiling, sepia-toned nightmare. Sand and grit blasted against the wooden walls, a sound like 1,000 tiny claws scrabbling to get in. They were trapped. The world outside had vanished, replaced by an impenetrable curtain of dust. Redemption, the mountains, the very sun itself, all were gone. Their universe had shrunk to the four walls of the shack. Silas and Ruby worked in grim silence, their earlier victory now a hollow memory. They were no longer fighting a legal battle. They were preparing for a siege. Silas jammed the crossbar across the heavy front door and wedged chairs beneath the knobs of the back door and the interior doors. Ruby, using her smaller frame, scrambled to secure the shutters on the windows, the wind tearing at her fingers as she struggled with the latches. "They'll use the storm as cover," Silas said, his voice barely audible over the gale. "No one will see them coming. No one will hear the shots." Ruby nodded, her face pale but determined. She had the journals and the box of certificates hidden again this time, in a small bricked-over compartment behind the fireplace hearth that she'd read about in Thorne's writings. Their fortune was secure, but their lives were not. Silas checked his old cattleman's revolver. He had 6 bullets. It felt like a pitifully small defense against Magnus Colt and his gang. He looked at his daughter, her brow furrowed in concentration, as she helped him move a heavy table to barricade the largest window. She was so much like Eleanor, the same courage, the same sharp mind. The thought was both a comfort and a spike of pain. He had failed to protect Eleanor from the world's darkness. He would not fail Ruby. The waiting was the worst part. Every creak of the house, every new shriek of the wind, sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. They sat in the dim, dust-choked light of a single lantern, the roar of the storm an oppressive constant presence. Then a new sound. A loud thud against the back wall, distinct from the howl of the wind. Then another. Silas grabbed his pistol, motioning for Ruby to get behind the overturned sofa. He crept toward the rear of the shack, his heart hammering against his ribs. A splintering crash came from the kitchen. One of the window shutters had been torn away. Before Silas could react, a figure vaulted through the shattered opening, rolling to his feet with a cat-like grace. It was Magnus Colt. He was alone, his duster coated in a thick layer of dust, his face grim. "Just you and me now," Ward Magnus said, his voice a low growl. He held a Colt Peacemaker, its barrel aimed squarely at Silas's chest. No judges, no respectable ladies. Just the truth. A sudden, violent gust of wind slammed the broken shutter back into place, plunging the room into near darkness, save for the single lantern flickering on the main room table. They were sealed in a tomb together. "What do you want, Colt?" Silas demanded. His own pistol raised, his knuckles white as bone. "What do I want?" Magnus laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "I want what Thorn and you stole from my family. I want the blood money that should have been ours. But more than that, I want you to understand." He took a step closer, his eyes burning with a grief so profound it was indistinguishable from hatred. "That woman you married, the one you let waste away, that was my little sister Ellie. And the man you let die in that mine, that was my father." The confession, though Silas had pieced it together from Clayton's words, still struck him with the force of a physical blow. "I didn't let anyone die," Silas said, his voice shaking. "It was an accident." "An accident," Magnus spat the word. Thorn cutting corners on safety timbers to save a few dollars was no accident. You, his right-hand man, seeing it and saying nothing, that was no accident. You were his partner in greed, Ward. My father and 16 other men died because of you. He gestured around the shack. Thorn hid here, drowning in his guilt, writing in his little books. But you just ran. You left my sister to deal with the wreckage. Her heart broke when our father died, but it shattered when you disappeared without a word. The fever that took her, it found fertile ground in a body that had already lost the will to live. You killed her just as surely as if you'd put a bullet in her heart." Every word was a nail being driven into Silas's soul. He saw Eleanor's face in his mind, her sad, tired eyes, in those final weeks. Had he been so lost in his own guilt that he hadn't seen her despair? The lock at Magnus's voice softened, becoming dangerously quiet. "That was my mother's. She gave it to Ellie on her deathbed. It was all our family had left. And you kept it. A trophy of the life you destroyed." Suddenly, the fortune, the certificates, the shack, none of it mattered. This was a reckoning that had been brewing for years, a storm of grief and vengeance that had finally broken. Silas lowered his gun slightly. "I never wanted any of this, Magnus. I live with what happened at Black Creek every single day." "Then you can die with it," Magnus snarled, raising his pistol. At that moment, the front door, weakened by the storm, groaned and then burst inward with an explosive crack. Two figures stumbled in, silhouetted against the swirling vortex of sand, Judge Briggs and Mercy Whitmore. They had followed Magnus, determined not to be cut out of their share. They took in the scene in an instant, Magnus and Silas, in a standoff, the shack in shambles. Mercy's eyes, cold and pragmatic, darted around the room, settling on Magnus. His back was to them. He was a loose end. "Magnus, you fool," Briggs shouted over the wind. "We had a plan." Magnus half turned, his surprise evident. It was the opening Mercy needed. A small derringer appeared in her hand, and she fired. The shot was a flat, sharp crack in the chaotic symphony of the storm. Magnus cried out, stumbling sideways, clutching his shoulder. His pistol fell to the floor. He stared at Mercy, his face a mask of betrayal. "The girl was right," Mercy said, her voice chillingly calm as she advanced into the room, the tiny pistol unwavering. "Too many partners. Your vengeance has made you a liability." Judge Briggs drew his own weapon, his face flushed with greed. "Now, Mr. Ward," he said, pointing his gun at Silas, "I believe you have some certificates for us. Hand them over, and we might just let you and the girl ride out the storm." The confrontation had shifted. It was no longer about the past. It was a brutal three-way standoff for a fortune trapped inside a wooden box in the heart of a hurricane of sand. From her hiding place, Ruby watched, her mind racing, searching for a way out of the deadly trap. The air in the shack was a maelstrom of dust, greed, and desperation. Silas stood frozen, a gun aimed at him by the corrupt judge, while Mercy Whitmore kept her derringer trained on the wounded Magnus. The lantern on the table cast long dancing shadows, turning the room into a grotesque theater. The box ward Briggs demanded his voice tight with impatience. Now, Silas knew that the moment he revealed the location of the fortune, he and Ruby would be silenced permanently. He had to stall, had to find an opening. It was Ruby who created it. From behind the sofa, she hurled a small, heavy object, a cast-iron skillet from the hearth across the room. It clattered against the far wall, and in the claustrophobic tension, the sound was as jarring as a gunshot. For a split second, both Briggs and Mercy glanced toward the noise. It was all Silas needed. He lunged not at Briggs, but at the table, shoving it with all his strength. The table tilted, and the lone lantern slid off, crashing to the floor. The glass shattered, and the flame fed by the spilled oil flared up with a hungry roar, instantly igniting a nearby pile of discarded newspapers. The room was plunged into a terrifying chaos of smoke and leaping flames. The girl Mercy shrieked, firing her derringer blindly into the smoke-filled darkness. Silas dropped to the floor, crawling on his belly. "Ruby, the back door," he yelled, his voice raw from the smoke. He could hear coughing and shouting as Briggs and Mercy became disoriented in the swirling, acrid gloom. He scrambled toward where he'd last seen Magnus. He found him on the floor, trying to push himself up, his face pale with pain and rage. Silas grabbed Magnus's fallen peacemaker. For a heartbeat, he aimed it at the man who was his brother-in-law, the man who had haunted his life. Vengeance was a simple, clean pull of the trigger. He saw Eleanor's face, her sad eyes begging for peace. He made his choice. Instead of firing, he grabbed Magnus by the collar of his duster. "On your feet," he growled. "You're not dying here." He dragged the wounded man toward the back of the shack, and the fire now spreading rapidly, consuming the dry wooden walls. He could hear Ruby struggling with the barricaded rear door. He threw his shoulder against it, the wood groaning in protest. With a final desperate heave, the door flew open, and they stumbled out into the relative calm of the storm's eye. The wind had momentarily lessened, but the air was still thick with choking dust. Behind them, the shack was becoming an inferno. Silhouetted against the orange glow, Silas saw Briggs and Mercy emerge from the front, their faces masks of fury at having been thwarted. They saw Silas, Ruby, and the wounded Magnus, and raised their weapons. But another sound cut through the howl of the returning wind, the thunder of approaching hooves. A group of riders emerged from the swirling dust, not as phantoms, but as solid, determined men. At their lead was Clayton Reeves, and beside him rode a man with a silver star pinned to his coat, Territorial Marshal Thomas Wade. Clayton had done more than just talk. After Silas's visit and the subsequent false arrest, his suspicions had hardened into certainty. He had ridden hard for the next county, seeking the only authority Judge Briggs couldn't control. The arrival of the law broke the standoff. Mercy Whitmore, ever the pragmatist, dropped her derringer and raised her hands, her face composing itself into a mask of a terrified victim. Judge Briggs, however, made a foolish attempt to flee, firing a wild shot before spurring his horse into the blinding dust. It was a short-lived escape. A marshal's rifle cracked once, and the judge's horse reared, throwing him to the ground. Marshal Wade dismounted, his movements calm and efficient. He took in the scene, the burning shack, the wounded outlaw, the corrupt judge being bound, and the terrified rancher and his daughter. "Looks like we got here just in time." Wade said, his eyes resting on Silas. "Clayton Reeves told us quite a story. Something about a dead man's fortune and a town run by thieves." Silas helped Magnus to the ground, propping him against a wagon wheel. The hatred was still in Magnus's eyes, but it was now mixed with a grudging respect. "You should have killed me, Ward," he rasped, clutching his bleeding shoulder. "Killing you wouldn't have changed anything." Silas replied, his voice heavy with the weight of the years. "It wouldn't bring them back." The full truth was laid bare there in the swirling dust, illuminated by the dying flames of the shack. The journals which Ruby had managed to retrieve from the hearth just before the fire took hold corroborated the entire story of corruption, greed, and the tragedy at Black Creek Mine. Briggs Mercy and the rest of Colt's captured gang were taken into federal custody, their reign of terror over. As the marshals led a manacled Magnus away, he paused and looked back at Silas. The burning anger in his gaze had cooled to embers of bitter sorrow. He said nothing, but in that final look, Silas saw not an enemy, but the ghost of a family, a reflection of his own profound loss. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape scoured clean, ready for a new beginning. Months later, a fragile peace had settled over the territory. Justice dispensed by a federal court far from the reach of local corruption had been swift. Judge Briggs and Mercy Whitmore received long prison sentences. Magnus Colt, his testimony against the others earning him a measure of leniency, was sent to a federal penitentiary. The weight of his crimes was heavy, but the weight of his grief, Silas knew, was heavier still. Silas did not rebuild the shack. Instead, with a portion of Thorne's fortune, the vast sum confirmed as legally his. By the courts, he bought a sprawling ranch in a green valley, miles away, a place of clean water and new life. But he didn't keep all the money. The bulk of it, the blood money from the mine, was placed into a carefully managed trust, the Black Creek Miners' Widows and Orphans Fund. He spent weeks tracking down the 17 families devastated by the collapse, ensuring they would be provided for, that their children would have futures their fathers had been denied. It was not forgiveness he sought, but atonement, an act of penance that slowly, painstakingly began to quiet the ghosts in his mind. One cool autumn evening, Ruby was sitting in the parlor of their new home, carefully archiving Elias Thorne's journals. She had come to see them not as a map to a treasure, but as the final testament of a man consumed by regret. As she examined the final journal, her fingers found a slight bulge in the back cover. Tucked into a hidden sleeve was a sealed envelope, the paper yellowed with age. On the front, in Thorne's elegant script, were 2 words, "For Silas." Her heart pounding, she took the letter to her father, who was standing on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains. He took it with a trembling hand, his face etched with a familiar pain. He broke the seal and read the words Thorne had written 3 years before. Silas. It began. If you are reading this, it means the world has found me, or I have found the courage to leave it. I write this not to excuse my sins, but to confess them and to free you from the share of guilt that is not yours to bear. The decision to use substandard timbers at the mine was mine, and mine alone. I bullied you, my friend, and threatened you into silence. You argued against it, you warned me, but my pride and my debts were a roaring in my ears that deafened me to reason. The fault for what happened lies at my feet. Eleanor's family was destroyed by my greed. Your life was shattered by my weakness. I have lived every day since in a prison of my own making. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive an old foolish man. May you find a peace that I never could. Your friend Elias. Silas read the letter twice, the paper shaking in his hands. A single tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. It wasn't the relief of absolution he felt, but the quiet, aching release of a burden carried for too long. The final piece of the past had clicked into place. The next day, Silas and Ruby rode to the small windswept cemetery where Eleanor was buried. The simple wooden cross had been replaced by a modest, clean headstone of white marble. Silas knelt before it, the cool stone a comfort against his hand. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver locket recovered from Magnus's possessions by the marshals and returned to him. It was polished now, the wild rose on its surface gleaming in the morning sun. He didn't open it. He didn't need to see the portrait inside to remember her smile. He gently placed the locket on the headstone, leaving it to rest against the cool marble. It was not a gesture of lingering grief, but of peace. He was no longer clinging to a ghost, but honoring a memory, a part of the past upon which he could now build a future. He stood up and put his arm around Ruby's shoulders. Together, they looked out past the cemetery, toward the rolling hills of their new ranch, toward a horizon that was no longer a place to run to, but a promise of home.